Here's what nobody tells you about intelligence. It doesn't protect you from being played. It makes the play harder to see. And the more capable you are at reasoning, the more convincing the story you'll tell yourself about why what just happened was actually your choice. The explanation will be detailed, coherent, airtight enough to close any question before it fully forms. And you'll deliver it with complete conviction, because from where you're standing, it will be true. Psychology researcher Keith Stanovich spent years mapping the gap between raw cognitive ability and what he called rational thinking. What he found was unsettling. Cognitive bias didn't decrease as intelligence increased. In some patterns, the data pointed the other way. The smarter the person, the more sophisticated the self-justification, the more convincing the logic that arrives quietly after the conclusion was already decided. This is what behavioral scientists call motivated reasoning. You don't use logic to find the truth. You use logic to construct a case for something you already want to be true. The conclusion comes first. The argument gets built backward, with skill, with conviction, and with complete sincerity. You're not lying to yourself. You genuinely believe it. That's precisely what makes it work. Now think about what that means in practice. The manipulator doesn't need to outsmart you. They don't need to win a debate or be smarter than you in any measurable way. They just need to touch the right emotional nerve before your reasoning even starts. Because once an emotion is active, the analysis that follows will tend to serve it, not challenge it. Your intelligence becomes the mechanism that seals the trap shut from the inside. There's a principle in classical strategy about this. Using an opponent's momentum against them. Their own force becomes the tool. The stronger the force, the more effective the redirect. Intelligence, operating without self-awareness, functions exactly like that. So the question that cuts through all of it, if you can't tell, in real time, when your reasoning is serving an emotion you haven't acknowledged yet, what is actually protecting you? Not your knowledge, not your vocabulary, not how many books you've read or how quickly you process information. Something else entirely, something that operates at a different layer. And the rest of this video is built around exactly what that layer is and how to develop it. Why the most perceptive people are often the least protected. Let's take it one level deeper, because there's a second dynamic running underneath the first one. And it's the part that most analysis of manipulation never reaches. High analytical ability and high empathy tend to coexist more often than most people expect. And when they do, they create a combination that looks like strength, but carries a specific vulnerability that practice manipulators identify before anything else. You can see clearly what's happening. You can name the behavior. You can describe the pattern with precision. You know, and still, you don't move. Because the moment you try to create distance or establish a boundary, something surfaces. Guilt, a sense of responsibility, the vivid mental image of the damage your exit will cause, the weight of being the one who chose to leave. Your perception is intact. Your analysis is accurate. Your empathy is what keeps you in place. This isn't weakness. It's a deeply human response being deliberately activated by someone who learned to find it. And it doesn't start at the moment of confrontation. It starts much earlier, through a process designed to be invisible while it's happening. Subtle criticism delivered with warmth. Calibrated sarcasm that lands as humor but leaves a mark. Gradual disqualification that makes you question your own perception before you ever think to question theirs. Each one small, each one deniable. Together, they shift the ground beneath you until you're operating from self-doubt that was constructed for you, not arrived at naturally. Think about how many conversations you've left feeling smaller than when you entered, without being able to name what caused it. That feeling isn't random noise. That's architecture. And here is what makes it particularly effective on people with high empathy. The concern they feel is genuine. It isn't naivety. It's a real response to a real signal placed there intentionally. Fighting it feels like fighting your own humanity. The defense isn't to feel less. It's to recognize when what you're feeling is being directed rather than arising on its own. There's a meaningful difference between those two states. Learning to sense that difference in real time is one of the most practically valuable things a person can develop. Has any version of this pattern ever shown up in your own life? Drop it in the comments. not the full story, just whether you've seen this dynamic operate close to you. The single condition that every successful manipulation requires. Every manipulation, regardless of context or complexity, depends on one condition. The target must accept the reality being presented as if it were simply reality, not a version, not a selection, just reality. Once that acceptance is in place, everything else follows. Without it, the entire structure collapses regardless of how sophisticated the approach or how much effort went into building it. The word that matters here is presented, because the most effective manipulation rarely involves outright fabrication. It involves curation, choosing what to show and what to leave out, selecting the angle, the timing, the emotional framing, presenting a version of events that is technically accurate enough to survive scrutiny, but is shaped, at every single point, by someone else's interest in what you conclude from it. Your analysis, operating on curated data, will still produce logical outputs. The logic can be internally sound, the conclusion can be completely wrong, and you'll defend it with confidence, because you reasoned your way there, because from where you're standing, if it feels entirely like yours. This is why intelligence alone fails as a defense. Intelligence processes what's in front of it. If what is in front of it was designed by someone who understood what you do with it, the processing becomes the vulnerability, not the protection. The actual defense is pattern recognition at a different level, not analysis of content, recognition of framing, the ability to sense, before the reasoning even begins, that the reality being presented has a curator, that someone made choices about what you're seeing, that those choices weren't neutral and weren't made with your interest in mind. People who are genuinely hard to manipulate are not necessarily the most intelligent people in the room. They're the ones who learned, often through experience, that cost them something real. That presented reality is frequently a performance. They don't analyze the performance, they recognize it as one. That recognition happens before the logical mind even engages. That's a different operating system entirely. It doesn't come from studying tactics. It comes from self-knowledge deep enough to know where your own blind spots live, which narratives you accept without resistance, what conclusions you want to be true badly enough that you quietly stop questioning them. If this content is delivering something real right now, the like tells the platform to keep pushing this kind of analysis further. 1 second. Disproportionate impact on reach. What emotional state actually does to your field of vision. Now, we reach the mechanism that most content on this subject avoids. Because naming the problem is useful. Naming the underlying physics of the problem is what actually changes behavior. Identifying the pattern is not the same as understanding where it enters. When you operate in a reactive emotional state, your perceptual field narrows, not metaphorically, physiologically. The same system that accelerates your reaction time in genuine emergencies also reduces the range of what you notice, what you consider, and what you're capable of questioning in that moment. You see less, you process less context, you respond to what's on the surface rather than what's operating underneath it. This isn't a failure of character or intelligence. It's a design feature being exploited by anyone who understands how it works. The person operating with calm while you operate with emotion, not competing with you on the level of reasoning. They're competing on the level of state. And in a contest of states, the more stable one wins, consistently, regardless of who carries the sharper analytical mind or the more precise vocabulary. The Stoics understood this with a precision that predates modern behavioral research by centuries. Epictetus, who spent the first half of his life as a slave navigating environments of extreme power imbalance, didn't describe tranquility as a personality trait. He described it as a strategic position, the ability to remain unmoved long enough to see clearly, not because nothing matters, because your response to matter must come from clarity rather than reaction. Silence, in this framework, is not the absence of response, it's the preservation of perceptual range. When you don't immediately react, you retain access to the wider field. You notice things that the reactive person, already committed to a response, can no longer see. This is the specific inversion that most people never recognize. The composed person in a high-pressure interaction is not less engaged. They're accessing more of the situation than the reactive person is. Composure expands perception. Reactivity contracts it. The manipulator who applies pressure is not hoping to overpower your logic. They are hoping to narrow your field until you can't see the frame around what is being shown to you. The moment you react, you've accepted the frame. The moment you stay still, the frame becomes visible. That's the mechanism. And once you see it operating, you'll recognize it in situations you've already lived through. Why the people who see everything miss the one thing that matters. We've covered the mechanism. Now the part that determines whether any of this actually changes anything. Most people who study psychology, power, and human behavior do it outward. They learn to identify patterns in others. They build frameworks for reading situations. They develop language for what other people do. That competence is real. It compounds over time. It has genuine practical value. And it remains incomplete until the same quality of observation is turned inward. Because the most reliably exploited gap in any person who thinks carefully about the world is what they don't know about others. It's what they haven't mapped about themselves. The emotion they haven't named. The narrative they accept without resistance because it confirms something they need to be true. The conclusion they're already moving toward before any evidence arrives. That's the entry point. Not your knowledge. Not your analysis. The part of the field you haven't lit yet. The Stoic practice of self-examination wasn't designed as a contemplative exercise for peaceful times. It was built for pressure, uncertainty, and social complexity. The daily practice of reviewing your own reactions with honesty, not to judge, but to understand, builds a map of your blind spots that no external framework can construct for you. You learn where you're likely to accept a framing without testing it. You learn which emotional triggers narrow your field before you consciously register them. That map is the actual defense. Not because it makes you immune. Nothing does. But because it closes the gap between when something is happening to you and when you recognize it. Most manipulation operates inside that gap. Shrink the gap, and you shrink the window. The people who are hardest to move aren't the most guarded. They're the most honest with themselves about the specific ways they're not guarded enough. That honesty requires looking at moments you prefer to explain differently, but it produces something intelligence alone cannot: the ability to see the frame while you are still inside it. If this opens something you hadn't named before, you're exactly where this channel is built for. Subscribe and turn on the bell, because what comes next goes deeper into the specific mechanics of how this plays out under real pressure. And one question before you go: what is the one belief about yourself you have never seriously questioned, because questioning it would cost you something? Leave it in the comments.